Tsardom of Russia, Moscow, Third Rome, Tsar Ivan the Terrible, in an evocation, by Viktor Vaznetsov, 1897. In development of the Third Rome ideas, the Grand Duke Ivan IV the Terrible was officially crowned the first Tsar of Russia in 1547. The Tsar promulgated a new code of laws, Sudebnik of 1550, established the first Russian feudal representative body, Zemsky Sover, revamped the military, curbed the influence of the clergy, and reorganized local government. During his long reign, Ivan nearly doubled the already large Russian territory by annexing the three Tatar Khanates, Kazan and Astrakhan along the Volga, and the Khanate of Sibir in southwestern Siberia. Ultimately, by the end of the 16th century, Russia expanded east of the Ural Mountains. However, the Tsardom was weakened by the long and unsuccessful Livonian War against the coalition of the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, later the United Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Kingdom of Sweden, and Denmark-Norway, for access to the Baltic coast and sea trade. In 1572, an invading army of Crimean Tatars were thoroughly defeated in the crucial Battle of Molodi. The death of Ivan's sons marked the end of the ancient Rurik dynasty in 1598, and in combination with a disastrous famine of 1601-1603, led to a civil war, the rule of pretenders, and foreign intervention during the time of troubles in the early 17th century. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, taking advantage, occupied parts of Russia, extending into the capital Moscow. In 1612, the Poles were forced to retreat by the Russian volunteer corps, led by merchant Kuzma Minin and Prince Dmitry Pozharsky. The Romanov dynasty acceded to the throne in 1613 by the decision of Zemsky Sover, and the country started its gradual recovery from the crisis. Russia continued its territorial growth through the 17th century, which was the age of the Cossacks. In 1654, the Ukrainian leader, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, offered to place Ukraine under the protection of the Russian Tsar, Alexis, whose acceptance of this offer led to another Russo-Polish war. Ultimately, Ukraine was split along the Dnieper, leaving the eastern part, left-banked Ukraine and Kiev, under Russian rule. In the east, the rapid Russian exploration and colonization of vast Siberia continued, hunting for valuable furs and ivory. Russian explorers pushed eastward primarily along the Siberian river routes, and by the mid-17th century there were Russian settlements in eastern Siberia, on the Chukchi Peninsula, along the Amur River, and on the coast of the Pacific Ocean. In 1648, Semyon Deshnyov became the first European to navigate through the Bering Strait. Imperial Russia-Russian Empire, Russian expansion and territorial evolution between the 14th and 20th centuries. Under Peter the Great, Russia was proclaimed an empire in 1721 and established itself as one of the European great powers. Ruling from 1682 to 1725, Peter defeated Sweden in the Great Northern War 1700-1721, securing Russia's access to the sea and sea trade. In 1703, on the Baltic Sea, Peter founded St. Petersburg as Russia's new capital. Throughout his rule, sweeping reforms were made, which brought significant Western European cultural influences to Russia. The reign of Peter I's daughter Elizabeth in 1741-1762 saw Russia's participation in the Seven Years' War, 1756-1763. During the conflict, Russian troops overran East Prussia, reaching Berlin. However, upon Elizabeth's death, all these conquests were returned to the Kingdom of Prussia by pro-Prussian Peter I of Russia. Catherine I the Great, who ruled in 1762-1796, presided over the Russian Age of Enlightenment. She extended Russian political control over the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and annexed most of its territories into Russia, making it the most populous country in Europe. In the south, after the successful Russo-Turkish wars against the Ottoman Empire, Catherine advanced Russia's boundary to the Black Sea by dissolving the Crimean Khanate and annexing Crimea. As a result of victories over Qajar Iran through the Russo-Persian Wars, by the first half of the 19th century, Russia also made significant territorial gains in the Caucasus. Catherine's successor, her son Paul, was unstable and focused predominantly on domestic issues. Following his short reign, Catherine's strategy was continued with Alexander I*s (1801–1825) wresting of Finland from the weakened Sweden in 1809–75 and of Bessarabia from the Ottomans in 1812. In North America, the Russians became the first Europeans to reach and colonize Alaska. In 1803–1806, the first Russian circumnavigation was made. In 1820, a Russian expedition discovered the continent of Antarctica. During the Napoleonic Wars, Russia joined alliances with various European powers and fought against France. The French invasion of Russia at the height of Napoleon's power in 1812 reached Moscow, but eventually failed miserably as the obstinate resistance, in combination with a bitterly cold Russian winter, led to a disastrous defeat of invaders, in which the pan-European Grand Army faced utter destruction. Led by Mikhail Kutuzov and Michael Andreas Barclay de Tolly, the Imperial Russian Army ousted Napoleon and drove throughout Europe in the War of the Sixth Coalition, ultimately entering Paris. Alexander I controlled Russia's delegation at the Congress of Vienna, which defined the map of post-Napoleonic Europe. Napoleon's retreat from Moscow by Albrecht Datum, 1851. The officers who pursued Napoleon into Western Europe brought ideas of liberalism back to Russia and attempted to curtail the Tsar's powers during the abortive Decembrist revolt of 1825. At the end of the conservative reign of Nicholas I, 1825–1855, a zenith period of Russia's power and influence in Europe was disrupted by defeating the Crimean War. Nicholas's successor Alexander I, 1855–1881, enacted significant changes throughout the country, including the Emancipation Reform of 1861. These reforms spurred industrialization and modernized the Imperial Russian Army, which liberated much of the Balkans from Ottoman rule in the aftermath of the 1877–1878 Russo-Turkish War. During most of the 19th and early 20th century, Russia and Britain colonized over Afghanistan and its neighboring territories in Central and South Asia. The rivalry between the two major European empires came to be known as the Great Game. The late 19th century saw the rise of various socialist movements in Russia. Alexander I was assassinated in 1881 by revolutionary terrorists. 87. The reign of his son Alexander I, 1881–1894, was less liberal but more peaceful. 88. Under last Russian Emperor Nicholas I, 1894–1917, the revolution of 1905 was triggered by the failure of the humiliating Russo-Japanese War. The uprising was put down, but the government was forced to concede major reforms. Russian Constitution of 1906, including granting the freedoms of speech and assembly, the legalization of political parties, and the creation of an elected legislative body, the State Duma.